Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 44th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. We bear in mind Rosa Luxemburg's remark, the most revolutionary thing you can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. And George Orwell's remark, too, that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. He wrote that in the preface to Animal Farm, which was suppressed by the publisher. He didn't want to hear it. This is a Pivot to Asia edition of News from Neptune. I have in mind the fact that for more than a century, U.S. foreign policy has been based on the axiom that it must prevent the economic unification of Eurasia because it would be a threat to the ability of the American ascendancy to exploit Eurasia, China and Russia particularly, and that has been the cynosure of American foreign policy at least since the time of the open door policy in 1899, when the U.S. told the European powers that they were not to exploit China in a way that would exclude the exploitation of China by American interests. The U.S. has followed this rule at the very heart of its foreign policy ever since. That unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s that we refer to as the Second World War grew out of the attempt of the Japanese to exclude American economic exploitation from China. It didn't all start at Pearl Harbor. The situation is such that we need to recall this history and this principle of American foreign policy as our chief magistrate, Donald Trump, sets off for a trip to Asia, which has the establishment of this policy at its very heart. We'll be talking about that some tonight, and we'll all be observing what it means, how it develops in the next couple of weeks. We'll begin tonight with David Green's laundry list.
I'm going to put my China note at the end here, so maybe we can talk about it. I'm just going to raise a couple of perhaps tangential issues in regard to your central concern about U.S. foreign policy in China. And I also want to note, I've been finding out, as you know, Carl, I work with third graders over at Bottenfield School, and a couple of them have come up to me in the last couple of weeks and asked me if I was on television. And then the teacher asked me, "Are you on television?" My children have been asking me, "Are you on television?" And I said, yes, I am. And so maybe we're appealing to 8-year-olds. I suspect it's 8-year-olds' parents, obviously.
I would be
that's
delighted.
That's encouraging to find out the people that I don't know about are actually tuning in. Maybe there's a few more people than we customarily kid ourselves about, our viewership level. And
maybe they're kids.
Yeah,
this is all to the good.
Kids, yeah. Although I have to say, if you're 8 years old and you're watching this, you might want to go watch cartoons right now, because there's going to be some X-rated material coming up here.
Really?
But anyway,
we have cartoon characters too.
Exactly.
Most of them are in the government.
Not exactly, but indulge me for a moment.
Certainly.
If I was to ask you, given your understanding of just two random people, Noam Chomsky and Leon Wieseltier,
yes,
the former literary editor of the long-standing liberal journal, the New Republic. If you were to take your understanding of each of those people, which of them do you think is more likely to have been a sexual predator?
I would have to say, but I do know something about this from elsewhere, that Weasel Tear is well named.
So, and the reason I want to bring that up, and I'm sort of reluctant to do this, but it's in our ethos right now, and everybody's talking about Harvey Weinstein, and there's the Harvey Weinstein fallout, and all these people being exposed, and I'll obviously say that's a good thing, but something we also have to understand exactly how it plays out in this political context. And there's probably a reason, even though we shouldn't be so simplistic as to say people who think good thoughts are always good people, or think people that I agree with are not capable of this or not capable of that. That probably isn't true, but nevertheless, it doesn't come as any surprise that it's Leon Wieseltier, or for that matter, Harvey Weinstein, who is under the gun in relation to these accusations, which are undeniable, obviously true, regarding their behavior at the workplace. In Hollywood, it's the workplace, sort of broadly speaking. And I also raised this. I think Thomas Frank, the leftist, I guess you might say, journalist, who's been instructing us about the nature of the liberal class and the professional class and the Clintonites and how they blew it and all this. He's been talking about Harvey Weinstein in some context in terms of his support as a regular liberal Democratic Party, Zionist, Hillary Clinton supporter, feminist who would define himself as giving to feminist causes. Okay, this is the way things work, and I think it's worth commenting on how these things play out. And they're playing out. I mean, I think the irony of this, I think, is that this is playing out in the age of Trump, because so many people thought that Trump's attitudes about women should disqualify him, whereas in the Trump era, it seems to be that the liberal aspect, at least in the two people I've mentioned, and others perhaps, are caught up in this net. So what that all means is that we should be, well, at least we should begin to look at what the hypocrisies of the liberal elites are in this country. That, I think, extends to Silicon Valley and other places where the hostile environment towards women has been noted. It's not like any of this is anything new. It's not like it's anything that hasn't gone on in the corporate context, in the academic context. Who knows where the next shoe is gonna drop?
There is an old SDS maxim that occurs to me every now and then when we talk about questions like this, which was the fact that young people opposing the Vietnam War long ago discovered to their amazement and would repeat to one another the observation, everything is connected. And it turns out that that's worth recalling at this point. The examples that you have raised speaks of some connections that I think actually have not been much remarked on. That's the connection between identity politics and class politics in these scandals about the scandalous behavior of these entertainment industry people. There's something very interesting here, because the person who has pointed that out most clearly so far, I think, is actually someone who is not in Hollywood, but who lives in Nazareth in Israel, Jonathan Cook, who has written very well on the issues surrounding Israel and the Palestinians. But Jonathan Cook had a column last week when she said, look, the Weinstein scandals and the related scandals, we have to realize that these are labor issues. What we're talking about here is the exploitation by powerful people in a characteristic modern industry, that is movie making, that is directly a matter of the fact that actors, primarily, and other people involved in the business have to sell their labor in order to eat regularly, and the circumstances under which they sell their labor turns out in many of these cases, such as the Weinstein case, to be sexual exploitation. Don't pretend that we're talking here about an identity politics issue having to do with men and women only. We're talking about a class politics issue involving employers and employees and the exploitation of the labor, in this case, the labor of actors. Some of my best friends are actors, and I have a great deal of respect for their labor. But what we're looking at here is the exploitation of their labor. And only under those circumstances can we begin to understand the arrangement that makes these crimes possible.
Let me just muddy up the waters for the sake of argument here, just to throw a little bit of a curveball at you and at me, for that matter.
Muddy away.
We often remark that the point of liberal politics, the point of identity politics, is to have people represented in relatively equal proportions, yes, in terms of gender, race, et cetera, at the upper reaches of our neoliberal economy. And what would you say to a feminist who argued, well, if there were more women in power, if there were more women in boardrooms, in corporate boardrooms, or in power in Hollywood, directing, producing, directing films at the head of these studios where these people have the power to make and break people, what would you say to them in response to the fact that, well, it's a worthy goal, at least, even if you're a socialist, it's a worthy limited goal to have women represented equally, or in the STEM fields, especially in relation to contexts which are becoming well known, in which not just in relation to sexual harassment, but in relationship to how people feel in the workplace when they're a small minority, sexual, gender, or otherwise, that these are worthy goals and would in fact change behavior in that context.
I think the only thing is to say, yes, we should find out. It would be interesting to know if that's the case. It may be. But it does point out the difference between identity politics and class politics. Identity politics, which was a halfway house, a refuge from the abandonment of class politics in modern American history. Identity politics has a theory of oppression, and its theory of oppression is discrimination and leads to the situation that you just described. Class politics has a theory of oppression too, but its theory of oppression is exploitation. The work of the worker is stolen from him or her, and that this is the source of oppression in society. Now, it seems to me that one has to admit that there is both discrimination and exploitation in contemporary society, even in Hollywood. But the identity politics notion is that if you get rid of discrimination, well, then we'll just let the exploitation go the regular way. Everyone will have an equal chance to fail or to succeed. This, of course, is nonsense. And that identity politics is not wrong in itself. It covers the nonsense of suggesting that that's the only problem.
Yeah. And that's what I would sort of, I'm playing devil's advocate to a certain extent, but I would say that, yes, the danger is thinking that you've solved the problem by dealing with identity politics, and what you've left is the much greater problem that people are going to be exploited on an everyday level in terms of their labor, whether there's
Exactly.
Discrimination involved or not, and that's obviously the problems that we usually want to address on this program, and the problems that I would hope to address in whatever contribution I can make to understanding a little bit of understanding about how the world works. So, I'll move on to the rest of my list here.
Go ahead.
You wanted to say, okay. There are. You also mentioned connections to be drawn There's a few connections that sort of popped out at me in the last few days as I was scanning the usual media. We're celebrating several anniversaries. The Russian Revolution in 1917, also the Balfour Declaration in 1917, at which Britain declared that it supported a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And you wouldn't necessarily think these are connected to each other, but the very astute analyst Shir Hever, who's on the Real News Network, pointed out in his comments on Balfour that one of the goals of that was to hopefully that in the midst of in 1917, the Russian Revolution was perceived as being engineered by primarily or mostly Jews, and that this would be a way, a kind of, I mean, in the context of all the fear and hatred of communism and all the anti-Semitism, apparently, according to Shir Hever, there was also an idea that you might sort of mollify the Jews in Russia, because the other factor, obviously, this was in the midst, or towards the end of World War I, and they wanted to keep Russia in the war. And so they thought they might mollify the Jews to keep Russia in the war during the events, as the events in 1917 from February to October transpired. So a little different historical wrinkle there in regard to that connection. And we're also along the anniversary front. 50 years ago, or 1947, that would be 70 years ago, just at this time, the UN, this is a continuation of the story that in a certain sense begins with Balfour and ends with the UN passing certainly not any kind of legally enforceable legislation, but declaring that Israel could be a state in Palestine, in what had up until then been mandatory Palestine. And it's important to understand this was, we're almost observing, it may have been November 2nd, 1947, and that it's important to note that it's at that point that the violence began in earnest, not in May of 1948. That's at that point that the Nakba began, in which the ground was being laid in terms of the civil unrest among the Palestinian population, which was still the majority and relatively equal in that part of Palestine that had been accorded to Israel, that had been very illegally accorded to Israel by the UN. So these events of the 20th century have some interesting relationships, obviously, with the current day and how we're reflecting on Russia at the current time, how we're reflecting on Israel at the current time. And I guess it's important to note in closing, in case anybody doesn't know this, Lord Balfour, who became a hero to the Jews, didn't much like Jews. He was pretty much a classic British upper-class anti-Semite, which, I mean, I'm sure no different than Winston Churchill or anyone else of his ilk.
Churchill was particularly racist, but I think you're right.
Yeah. I don't really know about Churchill being an anti-Semite. I mean, I'm sure that he was to some level, because they all were. It was perfectly acceptable to have certain ideas about Jews in Britain at that time. And of course, it's worth noting that played out, and Zionism played out as a result of the fact that Balfour thought of Zionism and the settlement in Israel as a way of solving Europe's Jewish problem, and Hitler had a different way of solving it.
But he started with Balfour's.
Yeah.
The Nazis originally were going to remove Jews and send them off to every place from Uganda to Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So anyway, that's one little note there. I wanted to mention a researcher, a criminologist named Alex Vital, who's been showing up in a couple of podcasts. He's been interviewed by Doug Henwood, and also on the Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting weekly Counterspin broadcast or podcast. Alex Vitale is someone I knew about from I think previously being interviewed with Doug Henwood and other people. He'd also written a chapter in a book called Policing the Planet with a friend of mine in town, Brian Jefferson, who's a professor in the geography department who researches issues about policing and race and so forth. And Alex Vitale has got his own new book out called The End of Policing, and it's just his half-hour interview with Doug Henwood is as informative a way for one to understand the history of policing, where it comes from. In fact, it refers to another British, Robert Peel.
Yes.
The notion of bobbies came from Robert Peel, and in spite of our relatively innocuous understanding of the role of bobbies in British culture, it wasn't so in the 1830s or so, when the police force was implemented to control the Irish troubles that were popping up as Ireland, when Ireland was still a British colony, so to speak. And it occurred to me to think in the context of this understanding policing and how it plays out in terms of race and everything, that even though we think of policing as a response to a violent society, it's really a part of a violent society. Those two things go together and have to be dealt with together. Alex Vitale talks about what an over-policed society that we are, and that we, of course, use policing to solve problems that ought to be solved in other ways.
This your apropos observation leads me to mention a book by a friend of mine. He wrote it a good while ago and has written some other important books since then. The historian Peter Linebaugh, who used to teach with me at the University of Rochester, we jointly taught a course on Western civilization from the left, so to speak, at the University of Rochester. Peter early on wrote a book entitled Crime and the Wage, which talks about the point that you were just making. He's talking about Britain of the 17th and 18th century, but he's talking about how the construction of the picture of criminality, so to speak, in that society was bound up with the oppression involved with the establishment of British capitalism. His teacher was E.P. Thompson, the author of the still very readable Making of the English Working Class. And it's this tradition of historical research that makes the theme that you're talking about, the construction of crime and the construction of capitalism, an appropriate topic. Yeah. They belong together.
Yeah, and of course in relation to that, we should remind ourselves that the word cop on the beat, or the expression beat, comes from the South, in terms of the slave controlling the use of the policing in the South to control the slaves in the early, also at a similar time in the early 1800s. Maybe goes earlier than that. I'm not sure on that. But and also I want to add in, since everything's
connected, right?
Today, the relationship between the Jewish Voice for Peace has been really on the case in terms of what has become euphemistically known as the Anti-Defamation League, which has been sponsoring programs in which police go back and forth between Israel and the U.S., in which American cops go to Israel to be trained in the latest Israeli techniques of control. Policing obviously is a whole hypercharged thing within the Israeli-Palestinian context. So you have another connection there between policing and Israel and the whole thing. So, and then you have that connection in terms of the last couple of days in which it's revealed that the U of I, our dear beloved private university, I can no longer call it public university, it's a private university, is doing corporate deals, is doing technology deals, funded by the high tech industry, investors, in the whole neoliberal framework And we're so proud of ourselves because Tim Killeen and Bruce Rauner are off in Israel cutting deals
Yes.
with four universities there.
Right.
And how this helps ordinary people. I mean, that's going to be the topic of my next letter. I don't know how I'm going to fit it all in there. There's been so much going on.
Yep.
But and beyond that, let me remind everyone who's maybe a little bit confused about this tax bill that's coming down. What the research, the Piketty research that has come out over the last 2 or 3 years, beyond the book that he published in 2013, has shown is that if you're a very wealthy person in this country, when you look at your total tax bill, federal, state, local, corporate, they figured out ways to portion it out so that it's all reflected in who pays what. If you're very rich, you're paying about 35%. And if you're very poor, or just modest means, you're paying at least 25% when you include property taxes and all that stuff. So we obviously have a very unequal, a very barely progressive, and certainly not progressive in reflection of the economic inequality that we're dealing with right now. And of course, nothing about this tax bill is going to deal with that. But it would be a little helpful if the liberal media would stop talking about deficits, because deficits are not the problem. The problem is how deficits are spent. So it's bad if there's $150 billion, or $1.5 trillion, $150 billion a year in deficits over the next 10 years. The problem isn't that we have those deficits that add to the national debt. The problem is that that's not being spent on things that help people. It's being given to rich people who won't invest that money unless demand is there. And demand isn't going to be there unless we have a very different system than what we have now. People are making a tiny bit more money now, but there just isn't enough buying power or consumer power among the 50 or 90% of the people who do most of the purchasing to really ensure that money is actually goes to investment rather than just into the pockets of the portfolios of the wealthy and sort of hoarded. So after all that, let me get back to China and just say that what I've been trying to, and I don't really want to, I don't want to put myself out here on a limb because I haven't done as much homework as I want to do, but I'm fascinated by the Chinese economy in and of itself. I haven't learned as much about it as I should, but the debate about the Chinese economy is whether it's still, it can really be defined as capitalism or even as state capitalism, or still as a kind of socialism or even a kind of communism. And there's been some debate. The British Marxist theorist Michael Roberts has been arguing that it remains a socialist economy, a state-driven economy, and that should be thought of in those terms. And that's been challenged, among other things. A good blog post by our not always friend Louis Project, who talked about that, but also another observer, another blogger who often appears on Counterpunch but has his own blog, Pete Dolak, has a blog called Systemic Disorder. That is a good name for a blog. He gets brownie points for naming his blog well, and he did a good extended blog post with some very informed comments by readers at the bottom, debating the issue of how we should think about China. And I guess the only thing I would say about that is perhaps, what these people are trying to do is to understand how the contradictions of capitalism, assuming at least partly a capitalist economy, or how everyone wants to define it, how the contradictions of capitalism affect the choices of the Chinese leadership. And Chinese has, Noam Chomsky's always saying, enormous problems with its labor force, enormous problems with labor unrest, as these hundreds of millions of people have been integrated in the global economy, and then China's leadership is trying to deal with that. They're also trying to deal with massive amounts of hoarded wealth or speculative bubbles, property asset bubbles, property land value bubbles, and property bubbles of various kinds, and elite that obviously, I mean, we experience that locally. Who do you think, who do you think the parents are of the students that are coming to school at our privatized campus here? So all these things, it seems like all these things, how all these things relate to your concerns about foreign policy, I'm not sure, but we certainly should understand. I guess the point maybe is to sort of knock down or question the idea a little bit of the things are running smoothly in China and they've really got a handle on things. I don't know that they do, so I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on that, as well as whatever else.
Thank you, David, for a detailed list of topics and observations that we should be considering, and indeed American media should be considering as part of our general conversation, and isn't. You don't hear these stories elsewhere. Our job here at News from Neptune is to sound like we're coming from Neptune because of the sorts of things we talk about that are omitted from the national media. I would like to begin with a news flash from Washington today. The U.S. Secret Service reports this morning that, I'm quoting, "The White House is on lockdown due to suspicious activity. A suspect is in custody," close quote. The Secret Service did not say whether the suspect was Donald Trump, but in any case, they do say they have a suspect in custody, and Trump is supposed to be going to Asia. So it will be interesting to see what comes of that. I suggest this is worth considering because what we find in Trump going to Asia is a president who attacked quite specifically the Asian policy of his predecessor, President Obama, and that Asian policy came largely from Obama's Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Trump attacked the Asian policy of Obama and Clinton, Obama's pivot to Asia, which was never very well explained to the American people. Obama's talent was always a talent to obfuscate what he was actually doing. But the policy was clear, certainly clear to the rest of the world, clear to the Chinese leadership and so forth. Only the American public was kept in the dark about it. And the policy was a policy of hostility to the point of war against the rising economic power of China. The internal circumstances that produce that rising economic power that Michael Roberts is writing about and so forth is very important indeed. But from the point of view of the U.S., the policy remained what it had been, that is hostility to economic integration in Eurasia, in China particularly, but the Obama administration upped the ante. It raised the pressure on China. A preferred method was, of all things, insisting upon freedom of navigation through the South China Sea. Much of China's economic life passes through the Malacca Straits. The South China Sea is the essential door into China. And the United States, literally for generations, has attempted to control the Chinese economy by what the Pentagon calls offshore control. Offshore controls mean controlling the sea lanes into China. And of course, one of the reasons the U.S. was particularly concerned about controlling these sea lanes is that it wanted to deny China, or to be in a position to deny China, the energy resources that it needed. China does not produce enough energy resources internally for the expansion of its economy that's occurred in this last generation. It has to export them. It has to import them. And where does it import them from? All over the world, but most notably from the Middle East. The U.S. has shown itself remarkably willing to kill people in the Middle East in order to control the energy flows out of the Middle East. That's why the U.S. is interested in controlling Iraq, for example, or Iran. The control of energy flows out of the Middle East, out of the Persian Gulf region, is what the U.S. is interested in, not because the U.S. needs those energy resources itself. The U.S. is, as it were, self-sufficient in energy resources, if you include the Atlantic Basin, is Canada, South America, Western Africa, which the U.S. does as a matter of course. The U.S. really, to everyone's surprise, imports very little energy, very little oil and gas from the Mideast. But China imports a lot. And if the U.S. controls that import from the Middle East to China, it has a chokehold over the Chinese economy. And that's been at the heart of the U.S. concern since the great reversal of American foreign policy in 1949, when this control of Eurasia passed out of the hands of the United States with the success of the Chinese Revolution. So the bedrock principle of American foreign policy leads on to the mass murder that the U.S. has been committing in the Middle East since the Second World War, precisely because of the need to control energy exports into China. And this is the situation in which the U.S. president goes off to Asia to discuss matters of international economy. And it'll be interesting to see what happens because, in fact, the Trump campaign for the presidency attacked these principles of international energy control, these neoliberal economic principles, as they were practiced by the Obama administration, or the Obama-Clinton administration. The minute Trump got into office, well, perhaps not the minute, but not long after the Trump administration came into office, it was turned away from its attacks on this international energy control and fell in with it. But American financiers and economic powers are worried that Trump will slip back into the heresies that he was preaching during the campaign, and they're worried that those heresies may indeed affect what Trump has to say and what arrangements he has to make in his current Asian trip. This is still the major issue among ruling groups in the United States, and differences between Democrats and Republicans, differences between even various groups in the larger American political sphere sort of pass away when we come to the real debate that's going on in American policy circles now, the debates that was sparked indeed by the, or at least represented by the Trump campaign. And the neocons and neoliberals too are worried what Trump might do in Asia. So it could be an interesting week.
So what are the divisions in the American ruling class? I mean, Trump is a member of the American ruling class.
Yes.
So what are the divisions in the American ruling class regarding China policy? Obviously, there have to be many. I mean, China modernized or became a capitalist country by getting American corporate leaders to export labor to them, to in a sense make a proletariat in China that hadn't existed before. Much of which has to do with making or at least assembling the goods that we so dearly love to find on the shelves of our local stores. So there couldn't be a necessarily unanimous approach towards China in terms of what needs to be done on any number of fronts, whether it's energy or exports or trade agreements or taxation policies, whatever. There must be different interests involved among the ruling class. Among the ruling class, that includes energy, that includes Silicon Valley, that includes the manufacturers of those aforementioned products, our coffee makers and our everything that you see on the shelves when you go to Bed Bath & Beyond or any place like that. It couldn't be that simple as you're saying, Carl, could it?
I think it's an important point that it's not that simple, and that any sort of mechanistic account of what the U.S. is doing in foreign policy and economic policy is bound to be wrong. There are debates and the debates within the American ruling class about how China should be treated are serious. There are clearly American members of the American ascendancy amongst dominant social groups in America who think that the sort of thing we were suggesting a moment ago is the way to go, that a cooperation with President Xi's Belt and Road Initiative and the establishment of an American presence, as it were, in the Chinese-Russian entente would be a good thing, capital G, capital T. There are people like that, including someone you were describing last week, the peculiar Robert Mercer, who's just resigned from his hedge fund. But there were American grandees of this sort who supported Trump precisely because Trump thought that would be a good idea, that an accommodation with Russia and China would be to the economic benefit of at least some American capitalists. There were other American capitalists, those grouped around the neoliberal and neocon authorities, that were deathly afraid of that. But there was a debate there that was going on, and Trump represented the surfacing of that debate to some extent, and the debate's still there. It's not going away.
One of those debaters, one of those neocons, is Robert Kaplan,
yes,
who has an op-ed in the New York Times this morning arguing that given that he's a sort of a China hater, I guess. I'm not sure if he's so overt about it, but he's saying that the relationship between China and Russia is a tenuous one with lots of problems, as is probably true, and that the U.S. strategists should be working more at prying Russia away from China.
This was the view that held jointly, with substantially different effect, by Zbigniew Brzezinski and the late Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. Unfortunately, not late. That's a little unfair. No, it's perfectly reasonable, but de mortuis nil nisi bonum.
He's late for being late.
Yes. In any case, they both, Brzezinski and Kissinger, within the last year, have made that point, that the Russian-Chinese entente was dangerous to American economic domination of the world, and therefore it should be destroyed some way or another. The two should be pried apart, as you say. The interesting difference between them is that Brzezinski, who perhaps because of his Polish background, hated Russia and thought, therefore, the U.S. should do a deal with China in order to dish the Russians. Kissinger, who had once done a deal with China, in part to dish the Russians, said, no, on the other hand, we should do it the other way around. We should take seriously an entente, an understanding with Putin on the grounds that will dish my old friends in China. So there's no honor among thieves. I mean, there's no reason to assume that they're being consistent. But they did make the point that you do, that the conjunction, the Eurasian conjunction, was dangerous to American economic domination, and something should be done about it. They had different recommendations about what should be done.
Yeah, and just to throw one more iron into this confusing fire, the economist Jack Rasmus has a column both on ZNet and Counterpunch, talking about, again, the internal aspect of China, the problems it's dealing with its currencies, its bubbles, the choices that its leadership has to make in dealing with both its workforce and the what's going on in the world from the inside, and he sees China in crisis now in a certain sense, in having a certain kind of financial crisis in which decisions it's going to make, kind of analogous in some ways to what the Fed does in this country, having to do with currency and the goals that they set, are going to affect the Western economy. I mean, they're going to affect our very pocketbooks in a sense, in terms of what's going on in China. And it's kind of interesting as I watch a little bit this week about this Chinese Congress, which happens how often? Every 10 years or,
Yeah.
or so? It's like they're still in this era. I mean,
5 years.
They're 5 years. They're all in this big hall. They've got this dais. This guy he's the great leader. He's still she is still the great leader. He's Mao Zedong. He's Deng Xiaoping. He's the great leader who's accumulated, who's basically incorporated his name into the policy. He's given a name. He's given his own name to the style of communism, or whatever he wants to call it, that China is practicing right now. And so all this is being done in this sort of autocratic context, whatever. And I don't want to make too much out of it.
No,
because there's a lot of people involved in this, I'm sure.
Exactly.
As opposed to what have we got in this country,
Yes. And also, I think this point has been stressed in the American media, that is the preeminence of President Xi, in part to ignore the extent to which the collective leadership of China is indeed interested in making sure that these social problems are dealt with. It may be a bit backwards to try to decide, well, is this a capitalist economy? Is this a communist society? What's actually going on? I don't think that may be too helpful. They may be good for analysis after the fact. They may be good for even the presentation of programs. But what's actually happening in China seems to me to be interestingly different to what's happening in the United States. I've been lucky enough to travel in China a couple of times recently, and when I was a callow youth, I fell into some serious people who were actually interested in learning about China, and took some courses in the matter from the great generation of American Cold War China scholars, notably John K. Fairbank and Benjamin Schwartz. Benjamin Schwartz was a most remarkable man who wrote one of the first books on Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution. Chinese Communism and the Rise of Mao his book came out in 1949, based on the fact that all these documents from the Chinese Revolution were fetching up in the Western universities, and old Ben Schwartz went and learned Chinese in order to read them and to say what was going on there, which seems to me something historians should do more often. And his book is still very much worth reading after all these years. So I can't claim any special knowledge of China at all. As I say, I was offered a taste of the scholarship early on, and managed to have the time and leisure to travel there a little bit recently. I came away with the notion, naive it may be, but I think perhaps accurate, that if you look at the leadership of the societies, the major societies in the world today, that is the U.S., Russia, and China, there are, of course, similarities simply dictated by scale, but there are also, it seems to me, an interesting difference, and that is that both the Russian leadership and the Chinese leadership right now know they have great social problems that they need to deal with in order to maintain the health of the society, and they're working on it. The American leadership knows that they have got to work very hard to maintain the economic control and concentration that the American leadership now enjoys. They do not have the same sense of urgency about solving the social problems of their population. Now, you can talk about historical reasons about why this should be the case, but I think we actually saw it played out in this last election, in this last American presidential election. The brains trust for the Trump campaign centered on this man, Steve Bannon, and he made the heart of Trump's campaign to be the assertion that the American ruling class was sacrificing the American population for the benefits of its profits from abroad, for the benefit of its worldwide economic control. And that this was finally disastrous in the long run for the society as a whole, but it was certainly disastrous in the short run for the American populace. We had seen, said Bannon, the immiseration of the American populace over the last generation. He talked about it in terms of jobs being sent abroad and so forth at the behest of New York, of Wall Street financiers. That was true. But what he was really talking about was the different strategies, the different strategy being pursued by the American economic elite in contrast with what was going on in Russia and China. In Russia and China, there was the notion of building the economic base, as it were, at home. In Russia, even against the American attempt to destroy that economic basis through sanctions and whatnot, and in China, an opposition to the long-term American policy of trying to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia. So we had the contrast played out within the Trump campaign, within the presidential campaign, and specifically in the Trump campaign. The contrast in that campaign was between Steve Bannon, who was speaking for this modernization, if you like, for lack of a better word, that the presidents of China and Russia were proposing. I mean, there was great scandal caused by Steve Bannon when he said at one point, "I'm a Leninist." And everyone said, oh, he's a terrible, Bolshevik. What he was actually talking about was this economic development that we're speaking of. But the other side, the other view, the view that has characterized American economic control, at least since the Second World War, was represented in the Trump administration by Gary Cohn, the former president of Goldman Sachs, who was speaking for the same neoliberal and neoconservative policies that had animated the Bush and Obama administrations. Bannon lost that battle, apparently. He's not part of the administration anymore. And Cohn is a principal figure in the administration. And sure enough, the Trump administration is following the neoliberal and neoconservative policies that it had attacked during the campaign and that were followed by the Obama and Bush administrations.
But, the American corporate ruling class, Walmart and all the rest, Apple, Walmart, They know they went to war against the American working class on the basis of exporting jobs to China. That's
exactly.
To put it in simplistic,
That's right. That's right.
terms. So what are they thinking? And then on the other hand, you've got the again, this is simplistic, but the military-industrial complex, which we didn't even mention before, in terms of all of these interests among the ruling elites that have to do with their interest in maintaining bases, presumed interest in maintaining bases around the world, including Asia. So you've got a lot going on here, but it's hard to understand how, when it comes right down to it, the American economy still depends on things being in stores so that people can buy them and that corporate capitalists can make profits. They've decided to go to China. They've gone around the world. We still make some stuff here, but still that in that context, China is seen as this threat. I guess that you just sort of put that again under the category of the contradictions of capitalism. But this just doesn't seem very clear to me as what the interests in the ruling class are to demonize China, especially because we have the history of using, basically controlling the world through force. China doesn't. Their military spending, they have 4 times as many people, and their military spending is probably 1/10 of what ours is.
That's about right. Mm-hmm. Once again, I think the question here is a matter of economic control. The U.S. has, for generations, been concerned about a challenge to the worldwide economic control of the American ascendancy. China is now is in a position to do that where it wasn't a century ago or even 50 years ago. And it's that challenge that is at the heart of American foreign policy, of turning aside that challenge, or as we suggested, what would seem much more reasonable, finding some way to cooperate with it. And there are surely people within the United States who are making the latter point, even within the American bourgeoisie, but they're not making it very loudly. And the American policy remains what it's always been: hostility to Russia and China, up to the point of provoking war against Russia and China. Look at what the Obama administration did in Ukraine. Look what the Obama administration did in the Baltic. Look what the Obama administration did in the South China Sea. Look at the Spratly Islands and the arguments there, and try to figure out what was the U.S. thinking. What was Hillary Clinton thinking as Secretary of State? If you look at these things, you see a pattern of hostility that has, as I've been suggesting, very deep roots indeed, and that unfortunately seems to have been adopted by the current administration. That's what makes this week's Asia trip so interesting.
Yeah. Just one footnote on an interview that the Real News Network had on with an academic named Jeffrey Wasserstrom, I believe.
I didn't hear him
calling his name. He teaches at UC Irvine. I think he gave a very good, is very much of a a lifelong China scholar, a middle-aged man, but has had a lot of experience, I think, and was very articulate in his understanding of what's going on at the Chinese Congress. Do you call it the Chinese Party?
Communist Party, yes.
Yeah, so that's what it was. Just
Party Congress, right?
It was just maybe a 10-minute interview that is probably worth watching. He seems a very credible academic observer of these things to me in the tradition of which you spoke.
And what was his observation?
I don't know. No,
well, I mean, let's pick this up next week. That's important.
Probably something. No, I probably should have made some notes on it, but I mean, I think he just has some insight into how the Chinese leadership works and what some of the ins and outs that I'm referring to in terms of the contradictions within China itself. He really emphasized a lot this kind of cult, this authoritarian cult of power that Xi has, and you might not.
Let's take this up.
Agree with that, but I mean, I'm sure he was stating that in somewhat qualified terms. But she is doing some real business there in China that is worth talking about.
I keep thinking we're talking to Ryder Haggard here, and she, we're reaching a certain point of diminishing returns here, I think. Yeah. One last comment on you started today with references to 1917, the Russian Revolution, and Lenin. And it occurs to me that we do this program around the corner from a little university, and it occurs to me that the university, which supposedly is talking to us of truth, beauty, and the American way, had very little to say about the Russian Revolution, at least that I saw, in the course of this year. The political science department, the history department, there were very few public ceremonies. I think there may have been one or two, but not many. Yeah. And it certainly wasn't widely commented upon. The most incisive comment on the Russian Revolution in this community that I have seen this year came from the Krannert Center for the Performing Arts, where they put on a brilliant production of Sir Tom Stoppard's 1974 play Travesties, in which Lenin is a character. And the actor playing Lenin had to do terrible things to his hair in order to get it to look right, but he was presented, and even more vividly, his wife was presented, and English commentators on Lenin took place in this play that takes place during the First World War in Switzerland, and in which James Joyce is a character. So it's only Stoppard's genius, the poets often get there first, it's only Stoppard's genius that allowed us actually to see and hear Lenin in this community this year. There should indeed be more of that.
We did have a nice lecture by Vijay Prashad about the relationship between the Russian Revolution and the Third World, or what was called the Third World, what is now called the Global South, which was informative also. So that's something.
Something is better than nothing. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 44th week of 2017. Presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green. Produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. With our thanks to Dr. No J.B. Nicholson for research. No's notes are posted on the blog newsfromneptune.com. And see the Facebook page for News from Neptune, which has a link to No's notes. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.